London, summer of 1973. Under the dim, smoky lights of the White City Stadium, Ray Davies, the restless genius behind the Kinks, walked onto the stage with hollow eyes and a forced smile. Moments later, before thousands of cheering fans, he would collapse mid-performance after swallowing a handful of strange-colored pills just to keep himself standing. The man who once wrote bright, nostalgic songs about English life was now slowly drowning in his own darkness. Behind the charm and wit of his lyrics hid a fractured soul. Haunted by the sudden death of his sister, a lifetime feud with his brother Dave, and a trail of doomed love affairs that left him empty. This isn't just a story about rock and fame. It's the tragedy of a man consumed by the very emotions that made him a legend. This is the untold truth of Ray Davies. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Before the lights, before the fame, there was just a quiet boy growing up in North London. The seventh of 8 children in a modest, working-class family. Ray Davies was fragile, observant, and always a little out of place. His mother, Freda, was warm and loving but exhausted, stretched thin by the chaos of raising so many children. His father, Frederick, a slaughterhouse worker with a fondness for drink, was affectionate in his own erratic way. Unpredictable, emotional, and often lost in the noise of his own moods. Their home was filled with laughter, but also with volatility. In the Davies household, love and argument existed side by side. A confusing cocktail that shaped Ray's understanding of affection as something both tender and destructive. Ray's world shifted irreversibly on the 21st of June, 1957. His 13th birthday. His beloved sister, Renee, the one who always encouraged his creativity, had just returned from Canada to celebrate with him. That evening, she gave him a Spanish guitar. A small, radiant gift that would define his life. Hours later, while dancing at the Lyceum Ballroom, she collapsed and died suddenly from a heart condition no one knew she had. The tragedy tore through the Davies family like a silent explosion. For Ray, it was more than grief. It was the birth of a wound that would never heal. He began to associate music with loss, love with departure, and celebration with catastrophe. From that night onward, Ray became both haunted and driven. He withdrew into his own head, sketching, writing, listening to the faint hum of the radio late into the night. His teachers called him dreamy, but it was more than that. He was building an inner world to survive the outer one. The laughter of his sisters became echoes in his songs. The tension between his parents, the unspoken rhythm of his melodies. When Ray discovered skiffle and early rock and roll, it wasn't rebellion. It was refuge. The sound of Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry gave him structure, rhythm, purpose. But beneath every chord, he carried the guilt of his sister's death. The belief that fate had exchanged her heartbeat for his. He once admitted in an interview, music became my way of speaking to her. That confession, understated and poetic, reveals everything. By the early 1962, Ray was attending art school, a place filled with eccentric minds and radical ideas. But even there, he remained emotionally distant. He painted loneliness. He wrote about people who never fit in. His sensitivity, his greatest gift, was also his curse. He saw too much, felt too deeply, and struggled to contain it. Friends later described him as a mirror that reflected everyone else's pain but couldn't recognize his own. It does not be a. Then came Dave Davies, his younger brother. Wild, impulsive, electric. Where Ray was introspective, Dave was pure chaos. Their chemistry was magnetic and dangerous. Dave represented everything Ray feared and admired: freedom, rebellion, destruction. Together they would build the Kinks, but their partnership was never just musical. It was psychological warfare wrapped in melody. From their earliest rehearsals, the clash of personalities was unmistakable. Dave mocking Ray's control, Ray resenting Dave's recklessness. The seeds of both success and tragedy were already sown. Yet even amid the fights, Ray's songwriting flourished. The themes that would define his career: nostalgia, alienation, class, regret, were all born from this fractured upbringing. Songs like Waterloo Sunset and Dead End Street were not just portraits of British life, they were encrypted fragments of his own family history. Every lyric was a conversation with ghosts: his sister Renee, his mother's resilience, his father's unpredictable love, his brother's fury. By the time fame came, Ray Davies was already a man at war with himself, torn between the boy who lost his sister and the artist trying to immortalize her. To the world, he was witty and ironic, the chronicler of English suburbia. But deep down, he remained that 13-year-old boy, clutching a guitar that had become both a weapon and a memorial. And though no one could see it yet, the same sensitivity that made him a lyrical genius was slowly turning inward, ready to consume him from within. The world of the Kinks didn't explode. It cracked open, raw and imperfect, like the people who made it. When Ray Davies first led his band through the grimy pubs of North London, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing a sound. Jagged, human, real. In 1964, that sound became immortal. You Really Got Me wasn't just a song. It was a rebellion carved into 3 distorted chords. The track's primal riff, created by Dave Davies' razor-slashed speaker cone, captured teenage frustration and British grit in a way no one had heard before. Overnight, the Kinks became both cult and curse. Celebrated for their raw honesty, banned by you. Hence, unions for on-stage fights, and adored by kids who saw themselves in their chaos. For Ray, it was vindication. But it was also the beginning of the cage. Success came faster than he could process it. Reporters painted him as the moody genius. Managers called him difficult. And behind the calm wit, he was quietly falling apart. The Kinks' American ban, 1,965-69, following a backstage brawl and union disputes, cut them off from the world's biggest market. For any other band, it would have been career suicide. For Ray, it was isolation. A forced exile that deepened both his writing and his paranoia. While the Beatles conquered America, Ray turned inward, documenting the quiet misery of English life with surgical precision. He wrote, "A well-respected man, sunny afternoon, Waterloo sunset." Songs that looked elegant on the surface but were dripping with melancholy underneath. Every line was a contradiction, bright melodies, hiding cynicism, humor concealing pain. His lyrics became small acts of rebellion against the machinery of fame. While everyone else sang about love and liberation, Ray wrote about debt, disappointment, and the slow suffocation of middle-class life. "I wanted to write about the people who don't win," he later said. And in doing so, he made losing sound like poetry. But there was a price. The more personal his work became, the more fragile he grew. He pushed his band mercilessly, demanded endless revisions, and clashed with producers, promoters, and even his own blood. The fights with Dave turned violent. At one show in Cardiff, a microphone stand flew through the air. At another, fists followed insults. Ray's obsessive perfectionism collided with Dave's volatility like a storm that never ended. Their relationship, symbiotic yet toxic, was now the engine and the poison of the Kinks. In 1969, Ray crafted Arthur, or The Decline and Fall of the British Empire, an ambitious concept album that critics adored but fans didn't understand. The commercial slump that followed cut deep. Ray began drinking heavily, sleeping less, drifting into spells of depression. Yet even as he unraveled, his pen grew sharper. He built entire worlds inside songs, working-class parades in Victoria, lonely dreamers in Waterloo Sunset, the bittersweet nostalgia of Shangri-La. His lyrics stopped being commentary. They became confession. Then came 1970 and Lola. The song, half scandal, half satire, became one of their biggest hits. Its subject, an encounter between a man and a transgender woman, shocked radio stations and thrilled the public. Ray had turned his obsession with identity, irony, and misunderstanding into art. But success was double-edged. Every hit widened the gap between his public image and private despair. He was the witty chronicler of British life. Yet at home, he was emotionally absent, volatile, and unpredictable. His marriage to Rasa Dids-Petrus was already disintegrating. Rasa had sung the backing vocals on many of the Kinks' early songs, her voice a ghostly echo behind Ray's sarcasm. But by the early 70s, the warmth between them had gone cold. She left, taking their 2 daughters, and with her departure, Ray's thin grip on stability began to fray. Friends later described him as adrift, half genius, half ghost. He would spend nights alone at the piano, playing half-finished melodies that dissolved into silence. Despite the personal chaos, he couldn't stop creating. He built Muswell Hillbillies 1971, part social diary, part confession. A love letter to his North London roots and a warning about the modernization that was erasing them. Critics hailed it as one of his finest works, but the commercial world barely noticed. Ray was starting to believe he was being punished for his honesty. He once said, "The more truthful I became, the smaller the audience got. As I'm Gonzaga way, I'm don't way." As the early 1970 seconds unfolded, Ray's sense of isolation turned into obsession. He micromanaged everything, the stage sets, the artwork, the interviews. He wanted control, but control was the one thing slipping through his fingers. During tours, he'd oscillate between manic energy and absolute withdrawal. Some nights performing with wild intensity, others barely able to speak. Band members noticed the pills, the strange mood swings, the sense that Ray was living somewhere between brilliance and breakdown. Yet on stage, he transformed that chaos into theater. The world saw a man brimming with charisma, strutting, smirking, mocking himself and his audience. They laughed at the satire, but few realized they were watching a man unravel in real time. Each performance was an exorcism, humor, masking, panic, swagger concealing despair. By 1973, Ray Davies stood at the peak of his career and the edge of collapse. The Kinks had survived bans, battles, and breakdowns, but their leader was quietly losing the fight against himself. He was exhausted, heartbroken, and dangerously unstable, yet still obsessed with creation. It was the paradox that defined him. To keep making art, he had to keep destroying himself. And soon, that destruction would spill into public view. In one of the most infamous breakdowns in rock history. The morning of the 15th of July, 1973, began like any other. The Kinks were scheduled to perform at the White City Stadium in London. A homecoming of sorts, after months of touring. But behind the scenes, Ray Davies was spiraling. His marriage to Rosa Dids-Petrus had collapsed. Letters left unanswered, phone calls unanswered, and then the final blow. Rosa taking their 2 daughters and flying to Lithuania to be with her family. Ray, already frayed from exhaustion and depression, was pushed into emotional freefall. Those close to him later recalled the days leading up to the concert. Ray was erratic, pacing the hotel corridors, chain-smoking, talking about quitting music altogether. He had written songs about loneliness for years, but now he was living inside one. On stage that afternoon, beneath the July heat, something inside him simply gave way. He grabbed the microphone, and before a stunned crowd, declared that he was leaving the Kinks forever. Moments later, he staggered off stage, downed a handful of pills and collapsed. It wasn't just a breakdown. It was a public unraveling, a man declaring war on himself. He survived the incident physically, but a part of him never came back. That day marked a turning point. The moment the private despair became a visible wound. In interviews afterward, Ray brushed it off, claiming it was exhaustion. But his bandmates saw the truth. The humor that once carried him had hardened into bitterness. He began oscillating between moments of warmth and inexplicable rage. The same emotional instability that fueled his songwriting now poisoned his relationships. In the years that followed, Ray tried to rebuild his life. And in doing so, entered one of the most volatile romances in rock history. When he met Chrissie Hynde, the fierce, magnetic frontwoman of the Pretenders, he found an equal. Their chemistry was instant and combustible. Both were artists, consumed by restlessness, both allergic to normality. Friends described their relationship as a storm that could never find calm. They fought, laughed, and created with the same intensity. At first, it felt like redemption. Hynde brought a spark back into his world. Someone who understood his contradictions, his fragile ego, his dark humor. They had a daughter, Natalie, in 1983, and for a brief time, it seemed Ray had found something resembling peace. But it didn't last. The same controlling tendencies that drove his art began to surface at home. Hynde, fiercely independent, refused to be contained. Arguments grew frequent, and when they tried to marry at a registry office in Guildford, the clerk, sensing the tension, reportedly told them to come back another day. They never did. The union that could have saved him instead became another fracture line in an already broken life. Ray's letters and later lyrics reveal the contradictions of that love. Tender one moment, cruel the next. He once told a journalist, "I love fiercely, but I ruin everything I love." That confession reads like prophecy. Songs from this era, like Too Hot and Property, drip with both affection and resentment. They are love letters, written with a blade. Hynde would later describe Ray as impossible, brilliant, and heartbreakingly self-destructive. I have goes nigh. Their relationship deteriorated under the same pressures that had crushed his marriage: emotional distance, mood swings, creative obsession. Ray lived as if every connection was a performance, part truth, part theater. And when the curtain fell, he was left alone again, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. Meanwhile, the feud with Dave Davies reached new levels of toxicity. What had begun as sibling rivalry had become open warfare. Dave accused Ray of stealing credit, of manipulating everyone around him. In one infamous interview, he spat the words, "Ray is a control freak. He sucks the life out of everyone. He's a monster." Ray never responded publicly, but privately, he carried the wound like a scar. The two brothers would continue to share stages for decades, but the bond was long dead, replaced by a strange mixture of dependence and disdain. As the 1,980 seconds approached, Ray tried to reclaim control by turning the Kinks into a theatrical spectacle. He directed short films, concept albums, stage shows, anything to channel the chaos into art. But the audiences had changed. The youth who once screamed for "You Really Got Me" had grown older, and the new generation didn't understand his irony or his pain. Each record felt like a plea for relevance and redemption, yet none filled the void. There's a haunting symmetry in how Ray's relationships mirrored his career. Every peak followed by collapse. When he wasn't fighting his brother, he was fighting the industry. When he wasn't sabotaging success, he was sabotaging love. Behind every creative triumph was a private catastrophe waiting to happen. His life had become an endless cycle of creation and destruction. Love feeding art, art feeding madness. By the late 80 seconds, Ray was no longer the symbol of British wit and rebellion. He was a man, quietly unraveling behind the legend. In his notebooks from that period, he wrote phrases like, "I'm trapped in my own songs, and I build worlds I can't live in." Those weren't metaphors. They were diagnoses. And yet, through all the heartbreak, all the failed loves, Ray Davies continued to write. Perhaps because writing was the only form of survival he knew. But as history would show, survival and happiness were never the same thing. By the time the world reached the late 1,980 seconds, Ray Davies had already lived several lifetimes. As a pop idol, a cultural chronicler, and a wounded soul performing for ghosts. But what fame had built, his mind was quietly dismantling. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were there in every interview, every performance, every silence that stretched too long between words. The man once praised for his sharp humor now drifted through conversations like someone half awake. His emotional instability had deepened into something darker. A pattern of self-sabotage, bursts of rage, and long, paralyzing depressions. Friends called him the most brilliant man you can't save. On tour, he was unpredictable. One night, a dazzling storyteller. The next, silent and unreachable. The same spark that powered his genius had turned volatile. And the world, fascinated by his eccentricity, kept watching. Unaware that they were witnessing the slow disintegration of a man who no longer knew where the stage ended and real life began. In 1990, the Kinks were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A night that should have been triumphant. For Ray, it felt like irony. As his brother Dave stood beside him, smiling stiffly for the cameras, Ray looked hollow, detached, like a man attending his own wake. The recognition came too late, and the wounds between them were too deep. The applause felt like judgment. He once said, "Fame is just applause that doesn't stop, even when you've left the stage." And we could die. Behind closed doors, Ray's health was deteriorating. The drinking had increased. The pills, prescribed for anxiety and sleep, blurred his days into indistinguishable hours. He confessed later that he couldn't sleep without medication and couldn't perform without alcohol. It was a chemical stalemate, the body revolting against the mind. There were nights when he'd stare into mirrors in hotel bathrooms, watching himself fade. The sparkle that once defined him was dimming into a dull, haunted glow. Then, in 2004, tragedy found him again. This time, not on stage, but in the streets of New Orleans. While walking with his girlfriend, he witnessed a robbery. When the thief snatched her purse, Ray chased after him. Unarmed, unthinking, driven by instinct. The confrontation ended with a gunshot. The bullet tore into Ray's leg, and he fell bleeding onto the pavement. It was a senseless act, but symbolically perfect. The man who had spent his life running from pain was finally caught by it. He survived, but the incident left more than a physical scar. It forced him to confront mortality in a way even his darkest songs never had. Doctors told him the wound would take months to heal, but Ray described it differently. "It wasn't just my leg that was shot. Something inside me stopped working." The recovery period became a time of reckoning. For the first time, he spoke openly about his mental health, about depression, loneliness, and the lifelong shadow of bipolar disorder that had haunted him since childhood. "I think I was born with melancholy," he said, almost like an apology. "It's the one companion that never leaves." With Ender with 3 Stardust, it was also during these years that Ray began keeping journals. Fragments of memories, confessions, sketches of half-finished lyrics. Many of these writings would form the backbone of his autobiography, X-Ray, a strange and poetic reflection written in the third person, as if even he couldn't bear to face himself directly. In it, he described fame as a disease of the mirror, where every reflection eventually turns into a stranger. Yet somehow, in his later years, Ray found a strange sort of peace. Not in healing, but in understanding. The bitterness mellowed into introspection. He reconciled, in fragments, with Dave. The two brothers occasionally performed together again, their voices older, thinner, but still bound by something beyond choice. Blood, regret, and a mutual inability to quit. Their reunion wasn't sentimental, it was survival. Even after everything, the stage remained the only place where Ray could make sense of his life. In interviews, he began speaking of death, not with fear, but with curiosity. He joked about haunting the BBC, about being remembered as the mad Englishman who wrote songs about loneliness. But beneath the humor was resignation, the awareness that legacy and happiness rarely coexist. "I've made peace with being misunderstood," he told The Guardian in 2017. Maybe that's all artists ever do. Make peace with being slightly broken. I have this present. The irony, of course, is that the world had finally caught up to him. The lyrics that once sounded eccentric now felt prophetic. In a time when authenticity became rare, Ray Davies' vulnerability seemed almost sacred. Younger artists, from Damon Albarn to Pete Doherty, cited him as a spiritual predecessor, the man who turned suburban despair into poetry. His influence stretched across decades, quietly shaping the sound of modern British music. Still, for Ray, redemption was never total. The old ghosts lingered. The sister who died dancing, the wife who left in silence, the brother who cursed him on live television. They remained with him in dreams, in half-written songs, in the quiet hours when the applause faded and he was just a man in an empty room. He never escaped them. He learned to coexist with them. "You don't get over things," he once said softly. "You just learn to carry them differently." I have this present, and perhaps that is Ray Davies' final truth. That art was not his salvation, but his mirror. Every melody he wrote, every lyric he crafted, was a negotiation with pain. He didn't conquer it, he translated it. His genius was not born from confidence, but from fragility. From a lifelong struggle to articulate the ache of being human. When he performs now, older and quieter, there's a strange grace in his presence. The defiance is gone, replaced by something gentler. Acceptance. He smiles at the audience, and for the first time, it feels real. Not the mask of the witty cynic, not the showman's grin, but a tired man's small, grateful acknowledgement that somehow, against all odds, he's still here. Ray Davies once said, "I don't write songs to be understood. I write them to stop myself from disappearing." I have this present, and in that single sentence lies the essence of his story. A man who kept creating not to be remembered, but to survive himself. His life is not a cautionary tale, nor a tragedy. It's a map of what happens when genius and pain become indistinguishable. When art stops being performance and becomes confession. He is, and always will be, one of rock's most haunted storytellers. The man who turned his scars into symphonies. This is the tragic truth of Ray Davies. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries.